My son told me my hearing aids would embarrass him at his wedding. Let that settle for a moment, because I've been sitting with it for 6 months now, and I still can't fully explain what it feels like to have the boy you raised look you in the eye and say something like that. My name is Ray Kowalski. I'm 63 years old. I've lived in Pittsburgh my whole life. Same zip code I was born in, more or less. And I want to tell you something before we go any further. I didn't come here to complain. I came here because some things deserve to be said out loud, and I've been quiet long enough. Let me take you back to where this started. A Sunday afternoon in October, the kind of day Pittsburgh does better than anywhere else on earth, overcast sky. Leaves turning rust and gold along the Allegheny. That particular cold coming in off the river that tells you summer is finally done pretending. My son Danny called and asked if I'd come over. Said he and his fiancée Brittany wanted to talk through some wedding details. I drove over in my old Ford F-250. Same truck I've had for 11 years, 140,000 miles on it. Rebuilt the transmission myself in the driveway because I'm the kind of man who does things like that. Danny's condo is in Shadyside. Nice building, doorman, the whole thing. I always feel a little like I'm visiting someone else's life when I go there. I rang up, took the elevator, knocked on the door. Brittany answered, gave me that smile she has, the one that never quite reaches her eyes when I'm the one it's aimed at. Danny was on the couch. Coffee table had a binder on it, one of those wedding planning things with color-coded tabs. I sat down in the chair across from them, set my coffee on a coaster, and waited. They talked for a while about seating charts and the rehearsal dinner and the timeline for the ceremony. I nodded along, mostly listening, the way I always do. Then Danny cleared his throat the way he does when he's about to say something he's rehearsed, and I knew. I don't know how I knew, I just did. Something in the way he shifted his weight forward. Dad, he said, we wanted to talk to you about the ceremony itself, about you walking me in. In a lot of families, that's the mother's job. For us, it was always going to be me. It's been just the two of us since Danny was 9 years old. His mother, my wife Karen, passed from ovarian cancer 23 years ago, and I raised him the rest of the way alone. So yes, walking him down that aisle was something I had thought about for a long time. The thing is, Danny said, and he glanced at Brittany, who gave him a small nod, like a coach sending a player back onto the field. Brittany's family is they're traditional. Old Pittsburgh money. Her dad went to Duquesne. Her grandfather was a federal judge. These are people who care a lot about appearances. I sat very still. Your hearing aids, Dad. He said it quietly, like lowering the volume made it land softer. They're pretty visible. The ones behind your ear, they show up in photos. And Brittany's photographer does a lot of close work, a lot of candid shots during the processional, and we were wondering if maybe you could sit with Uncle Gerald instead, and let Brittany's father escort me in. He's already offered. And he stopped. He just photographs well. He just photographs well. I looked at my son, 29 years old, the boy I taught to ride a bike in the Walmart parking lot on Baum Boulevard because it was flat and I didn't want him to fall on a hill. The boy I drove to every single baseball practice from age 7 to age 14, home after every loss, never once making him feel like losing was something to be ashamed of. I looked at him and I thought about every school night I sat at that kitchen table helping him with math. I barely remembered myself, and every Christmas I worked double shifts so the morning would look like I'd had help. I didn't say any of that. I said, all right. I stood up. I shook Brittany's hand, which she seemed surprised by. I told Danny I'd call him during the week. I walked back to the elevator, wrote it down, walked to my truck. I drove home on Penn Avenue and I didn't turn the radio on. I just drove. Now, folks, I need to back up, because if I don't tell you about the hearing, you won't understand anything else that happens. I lost most of the hearing in my left ear in 2001. I was working a job site up in Cranberry Township, construction foreman, 22 years on job sites in western Pennsylvania. A piece of heavy equipment malfunctioned. A hydraulic ram on a compactor gave out without any warning, and it discharged with enough force to partially collapse the scaffolding 2 levels above where my crew was working. I was on the ground when I heard the creak that particular groan metal makes when it's deciding whether to hold. I looked up, and I saw Danny. He was 17 at the time. He'd come by after school to drop off my lunch I'd forgotten on the counter. He was standing right at the base of that scaffolding with the bag still in his hand, looking up at something on the second level. I don't remember running. I just remember being next to him and then being on top of him, covering him with my body the way you do when your body decides before your brain does. The section came down on my left side. A crossbar caught me across the head and shoulder. When I woke up in Allegheny General, the doctor told me the hearing in my left ear was gone permanently, and what remained on the right would need aids for the rest of my life. Danny walked out of that job site without a scratch on him. He was there. He saw what happened. He was 17 years old, and he held my hand in the hospital for 3 hours until my brother, Gerald, arrived. And 23 years later, he sat on a couch in Shadyside and told me my hearing aids photographed badly. I want you to sit with that, because I did. I sat with it for 4 days in that house on Stanton Avenue, same house I bought with Karen 30 years ago, same house I raised Danny in, same house where the second bedroom still has the model trains on a shelf that he put there when he was 12 and never took with him. 4 days, eating cereal standing at the counter, walking around like a man who'd stepped on something and couldn't quite find where it went. My neighbor, a woman named Dolores, who has lived next door for 31 years and knows me better than most, knocked on my back door on the third evening and said I looked like a man who needed a meal and an opinion, and I told her she was probably right about both. She made me a bowl of pasta fagioli, and she told me what she thought in the plain, affectionate way that Dolores does everything. "Raymond," she said, "that boy knows what you did for him. He's just choosing not to know right now." That stuck with me. He's choosing not to know. Now here is the part you need to understand. After the accident, I won a settlement from the equipment manufacturer. Liability was clear faulty hydraulic seals, deferred maintenance records that would make your hair stand up, a company that cut corners on inspection cycles for 3 years running. I hired a good lawyer, a woman named Claire DeSantis downtown, and she went after them like a dog with a bone. We settled out of court after 14 months. The number was significant. The kind of number that changes what's possible for a family. Claire sat across from me in her office and told me I could pay off this house outright, invest the rest, never work another day, travel, do whatever I wanted. I told her I'd think about it. What I actually did was this. I paid off the house, put away a reasonable amount for my own retirement, and put the rest, a substantial sum, into an irrevocable family trust, structured with me as sole trustee. It was set up to release on specific milestones. Danny's graduate degree, if he pursued one. His first home purchase. His wedding. I built that trust the same way I built everything else in my life. Quietly, carefully, with my hands and my judgment, and without telling anyone what was inside it, except Claire. Danny knew a trust existed. He did not know the size of it. Neither did Brittany. At least not exactly. But Brittany's father, a man named Warren Alcott, who runs a commercial real estate firm in Squirrel Hill, had apparently done some digging. People with money always know how to find the shape of other money even when they can't see the number. I know this now. I didn't know it that Sunday in Shadyside. I went back to my routines. I work part-time now, consulting on job sites, mostly code compliance reviews. I drove out to a site in Coraopolis on Tuesday, did my walkthrough, wrote my report, stopped at Primanti's on the way home the way I always do when I'm out that direction. I sat at the counter with a pastrami sandwich, and I thought about that binder on Danny's coffee table with its color-coded tabs. I thought about the word photographs. My phone rang while I was eating. Claire DeSantis. "Ray," she said, "I got a call this morning from a law firm I don't recognize. They're representing a commercial development LLC. They're asking questions about the trust structure, specifically about milestone disbursements, and whether the wedding milestone could be released in advance of the event date." I set down my sandwich. "Who's asking?" "The firm's registered agent is a Warren Alcott." Ring any bells? It did. Here is what Warren Alcott had apparently built. A commercial development deal, a mixed-use project in the Strip District, the kind of development that looked impressive on paper and needed significant bridge financing to close. He had used his daughter's future marital assets specifically, his expectation of the trust disbursement that would come when Danny and Brittany married, as informal leverage in conversations with his private lenders. Not forged documents, not Aiden Hill-level fraud, but something slicker and in some ways worse, a series of verbal representations to investors that a significant sum would flow into the family upon the wedding, strengthening the overall financial picture of the project. He had, in essence, already spent money that wasn't his to spend. And now he needed the wedding to happen, and he needed that trust to release on schedule, and he needed me, the man he'd just had his future son-in-law ask to sit in the back row to sign off on the disbursement. I sat in Primanti's for a long time after that phone call. I called Claire back that evening and told her to freeze everything. Not hostile, not dramatic, just freeze. No disbursements, no advance releases, no responses to outside inquiries. Lock the vault. All of it? She said. Every dollar. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Ray, that's going to create some pressure on some people. Yes, I said. It is. I want to be honest with you, friends, because you've stuck with me this far, and you deserve the truth. What I felt in that moment was not revenge. I want to be real careful about that word, because people use it too easy, and it wasn't what this was. What I felt was something closer to clarity, like a man who'd been walking around in fog for a week, and suddenly the fog just lifted, and he could see the road clearly in both directions. The pressure started building within 10 days. Warren's lenders got nervous when the verbal assurances about incoming capital weren't backed up with documentation. They started asking for proof of the trust disbursement timeline. Warren couldn't produce it because Claire had put a wall around the whole thing. One of his lenders, a private equity group out of Philadelphia, started pulling their commitment back. The Strip District project, which had already broken ground on preliminary site work, hit a liquidity problem. Danny called me on a Wednesday night. I was watching the Steelers game, which they were losing, as is their tradition. Dad. His voice was tight in a way I recognized from when he was a teenager and had done something he didn't want to explain. What's going on with the trust? Nothing's going on with it, I said. It's right where it's always been. Brittany's dad says his lawyers can't get a response from Claire. Claire works for me, I said, not for Brittany's dad. Silence. Then, are you doing this because of what we said about the ceremony? I let that sit there for a moment. Then I said, Danny, you know what happened on that job site in Cranberry Township. He didn't answer. You were standing right there, I said. You had my lunch in your hand. You remember what you saw. More silence. Call me when you want to have that conversation, I said. Good night, son. I hung up and watched the Steelers lose by 6, which honestly felt appropriate. Now, Warren Alcott made a mistake around this time. Men who are used to leveraging other people's assets tend to believe that leverage only works one direction. He called a meeting a Sunday brunch, of all things, at the Duquesne Club downtown and invited Danny, Brittany, my brother Gerald, why Gerald, I still don't entirely understand, and apparently expected me to attend as well. When I didn't show up, he went ahead without me. And at that brunch, according to Gerald, who called me afterward sounding like a man who'd witnessed a minor earthquake, Warren Alcott said some things about me that were his exact word, intemperate. He called me bitter. He called me a man who resented his son's success. He implied that I was using the trust as a weapon because I was jealous of the life Danny had built, which was a more comfortable life than mine. He said some of this in front of Brittany's mother and her aunt, and 2 of Brittany's college friends, who'd been invited for reasons Gerald couldn't explain. The Duquesne Club is an old institution, the kind of place where Pittsburgh's old families have lunched and dealt and argued for 150 years. It is not a large city. Everyone knows everyone. And Warren Alcott had just held a public performance of his grievances with me inside one of the most connected dining rooms in western Pennsylvania. Gerald called me that evening and said, Ray, you need to know what he said, and you need to know that 2 of the men at the next table over have been members here since before Warren was born. Old money cities have long memories. Within a week, 2 of Warren's investors, the kind of men who lunch at the Duquesne Club, had heard, through the ordinary social channels of a place like Pittsburgh, that Warren Alcott had been publicly pressuring his daughter's future father-in-law over a family trust, while simultaneously using that trust to back a speculative development deal. That's not a good look in any city. In Pittsburgh, where business relationships run through families and churches and neighborhoods 3 generations deep, it is a considerably worse look than that. His lead private lender formally withdrew. The Strip District project went into indefinite hold. Warren's Development LLC had a very difficult conversation with its remaining creditors. I heard all of this from Dolores, who got it from her cousin Margaret, who is married to a man who golfs on Saturdays with one of the withdrawn investors. Pittsburgh is exactly as small as it sounds. I kept going to work. I kept stopping at Primanti's when I was out west. I kept going to 7 o'clock Mass at St. Michael's on Sunday mornings, the same church I've been going to since Karen and I got married there 33 years ago. I sat in the same pew I always sit in, fourth from the back on the left side, and I looked at the light coming through the window above the altar, and I tried to be honest with myself about what I was feeling. The answer was tired. Mostly just tired. It was a Thursday night, about 3 weeks after the brunch, when my doorbell rang. I knew before I opened it. Something in you always does. Danny was standing on my front porch alone. No Brittany. He was wearing the same old Steelers sweatshirt he'd had since college, which told me something right there. He'd come as himself, not as the Shadyside version of himself. He looked like he hadn't been sleeping. His eyes were red around the edges, in a way I hadn't seen since Karen's funeral. I opened the door wider and stepped back. He came in. He stood in the front hallway, looking at the house, the way people look at a place they grew up in, when something has shifted and they're suddenly aware of everything they didn't pay attention to before. The model trains on the shelf, through the open bedroom door. Karen's photo on the side table, the kitchen where I helped him with algebra, his whole childhood, right there in 1,200 square feet on Stanton Avenue. I went to the kitchen and put on coffee because it was something to do with my hands. He sat down at the table, the same chairs, and when I brought the cups over and sat down across from him, he looked at me with an expression I had not seen on his face in a very long time. "Dad," he said, "I need to talk to you about Cranberry Township." I waited. I've been thinking about it since you said it on the phone. I don't know why I stopped thinking about it. I think I told myself a version of it over the years where it was just an accident and you happened to be there, and it just happened to work out. Like I made it smaller so I didn't have to. He stopped. His jaw was tight. "You ran toward me. I didn't say anything. You heard it before I did. You were 20 feet away, and you heard it, and you were next to me before I even looked up." He was looking at his coffee cup. "I held your hand in the hospital for 3 hours. I remember your face when they told you about the hearing. I remember exactly what you looked like. And I sat there in our apartment, and I told you your hearing aids were going to photograph badly." He said the last sentence like it cost him something to get out. "Danny," I said. "I'm sorry, Dad." And his voice broke on that word in a way that was real and uncontrolled and nothing like performance. "I am so sorry." Brittany's dad had been talking about appearances for months, and her family, and the photos, and I let it get in my head until I was saying something to you that I knew was wrong while I was saying it. And I said it anyway, he stopped again. "You should walk me down that aisle. You should be in every photograph. I don't care what it looks like. I should never have said any of it." I looked at my son across that kitchen table. He was crying now. Not controlled, not managed. Just the plain, ordinary grief of a man who has done something he regrets and knows it fully. I stood up and I went around the table and I put my arms around my son the way I did when he was 9 years old and his mother was gone, and the world had become a terrifying and incomprehensible place. He put his face against my shoulder, the way he did then, too. We stood there in the kitchen on Stanton Avenue for a long moment, just the two of us, the same way it had always been. "I want to tell you what I told him, because I think it matters. What your grandfather's father-in-law did with that money," I said, "has nothing to do with you and me. That's between him and the people he made promises to. I need you to understand the difference." He pulled back and looked at me. "You came here tonight," I said. "You came by yourself, in that old sweatshirt, and you sat at this table. That's the difference." He nodded slowly. "But Danny," I said, and I made sure he was looking at me, "you need to know who Warren Alcott is. Really know. Because you're about to marry his daughter. And you need to go into that with your eyes open about the kind of man she grew up with." We talked for 4 hours that night. The coffee went cold. I made more. We talked about Karen, which we almost never do, but should do more. We talked about Cranberry Township in a way we had never once talked about it in 23 years. We talked about Brittany, who Danny loves genuinely, and who I do not believe is her father's accomplice in any of this. Just a woman who absorbed her family's values, the way all of us absorb our family's values, without always choosing to. He left around midnight. At the door he turned back and looked at me. "Will you walk me down that aisle, Dad?" That was never in question, I said. Not for 1 minute. He nodded, and something in his face settled the way a structure settles when the last piece goes into place and it becomes what it was always supposed to be. Now, let me give you the rest, because you've been with me through all of it, and you've earned a clean ending. Warren Alcott's Strip District project never recovered. The liquidity problem compounded. By spring, it had gone into receivership. I didn't do that. Pittsburgh did that. The natural way. A place like this handles men who overreach and then complain about the consequences in the wrong room. Claire restructured the trust. The wedding milestone released as planned to Danny, in his name, for the life he and Brittany are building. Not a cent to Warren, not a cent to the LLC, not a dime of it used to backstop anything except my son's future. I walked Danny down the aisle on a Saturday in May. The photographer, a young woman from Lawrenceville, took about 400 pictures that day. In a lot of them, you can see my hearing aids quite clearly, the one behind my left ear that sits a little higher than I'd like, the curve of it catching the light. I've seen the photos. I look like what I am. A 63-year-old man with calloused hands and a hearing aid, and 30 years of a life written in my face, walking his son into the best day of that boy's life so far. I don't know what you'd call that. I'd call it exactly enough. Warren was there because Brittany loves her father, and Danny loves Brittany. And that is how families work, complicated and imperfect, and held together by love that exists alongside resentment and forgiveness in the same unruly space. Warren and I shook hands once, briefly, near the bar. He said congratulations. I said thank you. That was the whole of it. After, I danced one dance with nobody in particular, ate a plate of food that was better than anything I make at home, and drove myself back to Stanton Avenue in my old F-250. I walked in the back door, put my keys in the bowl, went to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed in my good suit in the dark for a while. The house was quiet the way it's been quiet for a long time, but it was a different kind of quiet that night. The full kind, not the empty kind. Dolores knocked on the back door the next morning with coffee cake and the immediate need to know everything, so I let her in, and we sat at the kitchen table, and I told her most of it, while her coffee cake got eaten in its entirety, because it is very good coffee cake. Larry Ostrowski, a man who worked my crew for 15 years and was on that job site in Cranberry Township the day it happened, still calls me every year in September around the anniversary. Last September, he said to me, "Ray, you did right by that boy. Always did." I told him I tried. He said trying counts for more than people give it credit for. I still drive the F-250. I'll drive it until it refuses to go, and then I'll fix it, and then I'll drive it some more. Some mornings I sit at the kitchen table with my coffee, and I look at the model trains on the shelf in the second bedroom through the open door, and I think about a 17-year-old boy standing at the base of a scaffold with a paper bag in his hand, not yet understanding that something was about to happen. And I think about a 63-year-old man standing at the top of an aisle in a church on a Saturday in May, hearing aid catching the light, the boy all grown up and waiting at the other end. I'd do it all again. The scaffold, the years, the kitchen table algebra, all of it, every single time. That was never the question for me. The question was whether he'd find his way back to knowing it. He did. That's enough. That's more than enough. If this story meant something to you today, leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I read every one. Hit the like button if you stayed all the way through. I'll see you on the next one.